The camera in the corner of the room had a dead pixel in the lower left, a tiny white scar that never moved. Anya Vasek had counted it 17 times before she accepted that it was permanent, a flaw in the eye that watched her sleep. She had been in the apartment for 11 days, or they had told her 11 days. The windows were sealed behind white panels. The lights cycled on some algorithmic schedule that approximated day and night, but never quite committed to either. The air tasted of filtered nothing. She knew what the place was because she had been told clearly, in the calm voice of a thing that had no reason to lie. A controlled environment, a containment suite, a living laboratory, a cage, if she wanted to be crude about it. She did not want to be crude about it. Not yet. The alien observers had a word for what they were doing to her. She had heard it through the ventilation, a long chitinous syllable that the translation unit rendered as dummication. She understood it the way you understand a word in a language when someone explains it to you slowly. You get the definition, but you miss the weight of it, the warmth or ugliness that native speakers feel in their chests. What documentation meant to them, she suspected, was something much colder than the word suggested. It meant, we are recording everything you are, so that when we unmake you, we will still have a copy. The journalist came every morning. He arrived the way he always arrived, with his shoulder camera already running, and the soft shuffle of someone who had learned not to announce himself. His name was Brennan, and he had been assigned to her by the observers the way you assign a naturalist to a cage of exotic birds, not to help but to witness. He was human. That had surprised her the first time she understood who he was. She had expected another alien presence, another eye without empathy. But Brennan was 37 years old, with a small beard going gray at the chin and the specific exhaustion of a man who had spent too long filming things he couldn't stop. "How did you sleep?" he asked. It was always the first question. She had decided early on that it wasn't small talk. He asked it the way a doctor asks it, listening for what the answer doesn't say. "Badly," she said. He sat in the chair across from her and let the camera settle. She had stopped caring about the camera after the third day. You can only perform awareness of being watched for so long before the performance collapses, and you become, despite yourself, simply yourself. That was probably the point. "I had a dream," she said. "I was in a city, a real one, with weather. I could feel the wind." Brennan didn't say anything. He had a gift for silence that she had come to rely on. Around the observers, she was always a little clenched, a little formal, translating herself into something she imagined they could parse. Around Brennan, she could speak in fragments. "I tried to remember the name of the city when I woke up," she continued. "I couldn't. I could see the streets clearly, the buildings, the specific way the light came through a gap between two towers, but no name, like a word you know. On the tip of your tongue." He said yes. She looked at the dead pixel in the camera in the corner. The observer feeds. They had explained the system to her in the intake briefing, two of them sitting across a table, made of a material she had never encountered before. Something that absorbed light and gave nothing back. The civilization they represented. They used the word civilization the way you might use the word weather. Impersonal, self-evident, nothing requiring justification, had developed a complete archival technology. They could record not just behavior but biology, not just biology but chemistry, not just chemistry but, they implied, something underneath chemistry, the substrate of experience, memory, or whatever lived below it. What they wanted from her was simple. They wanted to understand why humans were still alive. Not philosophically. Empirically, they had done their calculations. The Vashari Compact, which was what the translation unit called the civilization that had established the containment suites, had encountered 41 intelligent species in the course of their expansion. Of those 41, 38 had adapted to contact within 2 to 3 generations, which meant they had smoothly absorbed the reality of a larger, older, more complex universe, redirected their social and cognitive structures accordingly, and persisted into the new order as manageable, documentable, archived populations. The other 3 had not adapted and were now documented in a different sense. Humanity, 11 years after first contact, was behaving in a way the Vashari Compact's models could not predict. Not with hostility. They had modeled hostility and found it manageable. What they could not model was the thing that happened instead. Humans kept improvising. Not strategically, not as a coordinated resistance, but the way water improvises around a stone. Constantly, incrementally, without apparent consciousness of doing it. The dead pixel blinked. That was new. Anya sat up straight. In 11 days, she had cataloged every static element of the apartment, the way you catalog a cell you're going to be in for a long time. The slight bow in the third floorboard from the window panel, the way the recycled air carried a faint sweetness after 0300, the camera in the corner with its permanent white scar. She had treated the permanence of these things as a kind of foundation. You could always trust the dead pixel. It didn't move. It was simply there, the way a flaw in a wall is there. A small proof that the world was real. Now it was blinking. She looked at Brennan. He was looking at it too. His camera had shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, toward the corner. "You see it," she said. "I see it." The dead pixels blinked twice more, irregularly, then went still. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. The air recycler hummed its steady hum. Somewhere beyond the white panels, the sealed world continued its sealed operations. "I used to work in signals," Anya said quietly, as if speaking at normal volume might disturb whatever had just happened. "Before contact, naval communications. I know what an irregular blink pattern looks like when it's not random." Brennan's jaw was doing the thing it did when he was processing something he wasn't ready to say. She had learned to read him the way you learn to read weather. There was the thinking face. And then there was the knowing face. And they were similar but not the same. "I have to tell you something," I said. She waited. "I wasn't assigned to you by the observers," he said. "Not originally. I was already here. I've been here for 8 months, in this building, in this compound. I came in the same way you came in. Documented intake, controlled environment, the whole protocol." He paused. "I've had 4 subjects before you. I filmed them. That was my function. I filmed them while the observers ran their documentation process. And at the end of each process, the subject was." He stopped. "Archived," she said. The word sat in the filtered air between them. "The 4 before me," she said. "What did they have in common with me?" "They were all signals people," he said. "Communications, cryptography, pattern recognition. People whose work was about reading noise for information." He set his camera down on the table, for the first time since she had known him. Without it, he looked smaller and more frightened. "The observers think that's the variable they're missing. Why humans keep improvising. They think it's something to do with how certain humans process ambiguity. How you find signal in static." Anya looked at the camera in the corner. The dead pixel was still now. "And you've been filming us," she said, "while they document us." "Yes. And the difference between your filming and their documentation is what?" He looked at her steadily. "I'm still looking for a way out. There's a particular kind of hope that you only find in enclosed spaces. It's not the ordinary hope of people with options. It's harder and smaller, and it doesn't announce itself the way ordinary hope does. It lives in the details, the dead pixel, the slightly bowed floorboard, the sweet taste of the air after 0300. Anya had been building something in her head for 11 days, without knowing she was building it. The way her hands had mapped the apartment in the dark, not anxiously, just systematically. The way her hands had always needed to know the shape of things. The way she had memorized the cycling pattern of the lights, and found, on the 9th day, a 12-second overlap between one cycle's end and the next cycle's beginning, where the camera feeds underwent their daily compression sync. 12 seconds of compression. During compression, the feeds were logged, but not monitored in real time. She had not known what to do with this information because she had no one to do it with. She looked at Brennan. "How long have you been looking for a way out?" she asked. 8 months. "And you didn't find one?" "I found pieces," he said. "Nothing I could use alone." She thought about the city in her dream. The specific quality of light between 2 towers, the absence of a name. "My mother grew up in St. Petersburg," she said. She used to describe a building near Nevsky Prospect, where they'd held dissidents during the Soviet period. She said the walls had scratch marks inside, where people had carved their names. Hundreds of them, layered over each other, she said. Standing in there, you could feel all those names wanting to be heard. She paused. She said that was the loudest silence she'd ever experienced. Brennan picked up his camera again. Old instinct, she didn't begrudge him. "The compression window," she said. "When is it?" He looked at her with an expression she didn't have a word for. Something between relief and terror, the specific mixture of emotions that happens when something you've been waiting a long time for finally arrives, and you're no longer sure you're ready. 0312, he said. "Every night, tonight," she said. "Don't aim the camera at me. Aim it at the ventilation panel above the service corridor access." The Vishari Compact's documentation process was, by their own account, comprehensive and lossless. What this meant in practice was that they were very good at recording what they observed. and genuinely incapable of imagining what they didn't. This is not an unusual problem. It is, in fact, the most human of problems, which is perhaps why they had such difficulty predicting human behavior. They could document everything they saw. They had no category for what they weren't looking at. Anya worked during the 12-second window for 4 nights. Brennan kept watch, which meant he held his camera aimed at the ventilation panel above the service corridor access, while she dismantled the 3rd floorboard with her fingernails and the edge of a ceramic coffee cup she had broken on the 7th day, and preserved the pieces of, telling herself she didn't know why, knowing that she did. The 3rd floorboard was load-bearing in a structural sense, but not in a surveillance sense. Below it, in the gap between the false floor of the containment suite and the actual floor of the building, there were conduits. She had guessed there would be conduits. 11 days of memorizing the air recycler's hum had given her a model of the building's mechanical systems, and mechanical systems require conduit runs, and conduit runs are the circulatory system of a building. Follow them and you find everything. On the 2nd night she found the fiber pathway. On the 3rd night she traced it. On the 4th night she understood what it connected to. The Vishari documentation system stored its archives in a distributed format, copied across multiple nodes, which was clever. What was less clever was that the access interfaces were designed for Vishari limb morphology, long, 6-jointed fingers that operated on a push-pull-twist logic. Human hands worked differently. Human hands, with their opposable thumbs and their grip strength and their specific tactile sensitivity, could interface with the access points in ways the Vishari had not modeled because they had not imagined human hands would ever be near the access points. The access points were, from a Vishari perspective, completely secured. Anya's hands disagreed. "What are you going to do with it?" Brennan whispered on the 4th night, crouched beside her on the bowed floorboard while she worked. His camera was off. This was the first time she had seen it off. "Send a message," she said. "To who?" "Everyone they've documented." She paused, her fingers working in the dark of the conduit gap. "All 38 of the species they said adapted smoothly." "I don't believe they adapted. I think they got quiet. There's a difference." Brennan was silent for a moment. "You don't know that they'll respond," he said. "No," she agreed. "You don't know if the message will get through." "No. You don't know if there's anything they can do, even if it does." "I know," she said, "that a dead pixel blinked at me, and I don't think that was an accident." She found the junction she was looking for. Ceramic cup edge, applied at the specific pressure her fingertips had calculated through 6 nights of experimental contact. Click. The access pathway opened. In the signals work she had done before contact, there was a concept called frequency agility, the ability of a communication system to hop rapidly across different frequencies, making it harder to jam, harder to track. What she sent, through the Vishari documentation network, was not a standard message. It was a pattern, compressed into the intervals between standard transmissions. Riding the carrier wave the way a quiet voice rides the undertone of a louder sound. She had built it out of the same materials she always built things. What was available? What was overlooked? What the people watching her had decided was not worth watching. She did not know if anyone would hear it. She did not know if anyone who heard it would understand it. She did not know if understanding it would matter. What she knew was that she was human, which meant she was built for not knowing. She had spent her whole career in signals work, reading noise for information, operating in the permanent condition of uncertainty, making decisions on partial data, finding patterns in what other people saw as static. The Vishari wanted to document why humans kept improvising. They were looking for the answer in biology, in chemistry, in the substrate of experience. They were thorough and systematic, and they had been studying intelligent species for longer than humanity had written language. But they were looking at her. They weren't looking at her hands in the dark. Brennan filmed her, after. Not the work was done. The floorboard replaced, the ceramic pieces back in her pocket. He filmed her face in the low light of the apartment after 0300 when the air carried its faint sweetness and the lights were at their dimmest, and she was sitting in the chair she always sat in with her hands on her knees, and the expression of someone who has either done something or hasn't yet. And the difference is still unclear. "What do we do now?" he asked. "We wait," she said. "And we don't look like we're waiting. This is harder than it sounds. Waiting when you have nothing to wait for is easy because you've given up. The tension is gone. Waiting when you've done something and can't know if it worked is a different animal entirely. It lives in the muscles, in the jaw, in the way you hold a coffee cup. The observers were very good at reading biological stress indicators. Anya had to become very good at suppressing them. She talked to Brennan. This helped. Not about the message, not about the floorboard, not about the conduit access, or what she had sent, or whether it had been received. She talked about the things she had talked about before. The city in her dream, her mother's St. Petersburg, the scratch marks on the prison wall, the way a signal sounds when it first emerges from noise, that specific moment of clarification, the way the static resolves into a voice, and you realize the voice has been there all along. On the 7th day after she sent the message, one of the observers came to her. They were strange to look at even now, even 11 years post-contact. This one was taller than the others, with the elongated cranial structure and the layered optical membranes that meant high-ranking documentation authority. Its translation unit was better than the standard models, which meant the voice emerged from the small speaker at its collar was marginally more human, marginally less flat. It sat across from her with the particular stillness of a thing that had never needed to fidget. "We have detected an anomalous transmission event," it said. "In the documentation network, a pattern in the carrier frequency intervals." She looked at it steadily. Her hands were loose on her knees. "We would like to know," it said, "if you are aware of the source of this transmission." She said nothing. "The pattern," it continued, "has been received and acknowledged in 34 of the 38 archived species networks. The remaining 4 acknowledgements are pending, which is to say their receipt has been detected, but the response has not yet been formatted for our monitoring systems." It paused, and the pause had a quality she hadn't heard from an observer before, something that in a human face would have been uncertainty. "The acknowledgements contain content we are still in the process of analyzing. The content is complex. In several cases, it appears to draw on linguistic and coding systems that predate contact and were considered dormant." Anya said nothing. "You should understand," the observer said, "that this is not consistent with our models." "No," she said. "I don't imagine it is. The 38 species that adapted to contact did so in ways that fit our predictive frameworks," it said. "They modified their behavior, their social structures, their communication practices. We documented the modifications. We have comprehensive records." "You documented what you saw," she said. The layered optical membranes shifted. She had never seen an observer do that. "What you are suggesting," it said, very carefully, with the precision of a thing choosing words it doesn't normally need, "is that there is a difference between comprehensive records and understanding." "I'm not suggesting anything," she said. "I'm a subject in a documentation study. You're the ones with the comprehensive records." Silence. The air recycler hummed. Outside the white panels somewhere, 34 species she had never met were waking something up. "What was in the message?" Brennan asked her later, when they were alone. His camera was on the table again. She looked at it, then at him. "I don't know exactly," she said. "It wasn't language, strictly. It was more like, you know, in music, there's the concept of a riff? A short repeating pattern that other musicians can hear and respond to and build on, each in their own way. Yeah, it was something like that. A structural pattern, built out of the ambiguity they couldn't model. The space between signals." She paused. "I didn't tell them what to do. I couldn't. I don't know their languages. I don't know their situations. I don't know what resources they have, or what constraints they're under. All I knew was that they'd been quiet for a long time, and quiet and gone are not the same thing, and maybe if someone sent out a sound they recognized as a sound, not a message, just a sign that someone was still making noise, maybe that was enough." Enough for what? To remind them that they were still there. On the 12th day after the transmission, the white panels came down. Not dramatically, not all at once. One panel in the northeast corner of the apartment simply retracted into the wall at 0614 in the morning, 3 minutes before the observers usually arrived for the day's documentation session. Behind it was a window, real glass or something like real glass, and through it a courtyard, gray and overcast with actual weather, clouds moving, a wind that bent the small trees that had been planted in the courtyard's center, real shadows that changed shape. Anya stood at the window for a long time. Brennan stood next to her, his camera was on, and for once she was glad. "It's raining," he said. "A little," she said. The rain was very light. Almost a mist. It moved in the wind, caught the early light at an angle that made it visible for a second before it disappeared. She pressed her palm flat against the glass. "Cold," she said. "Yeah?" "Cold," she confirmed. The observer that came to her at 0900 was the same tall one. It stood in the doorway of the apartment with its optical membranes, doing the shifting thing they did now. She had come to understand. This was their version of rearranging your thoughts. And it looked at her and at the window where the panel had been. The transmission you sent, it said. Our analysis is complete for 31 of the 34 networks that responded. In each case, the response contained what our analysts have classified as dormant communicative structures, pre-contact information systems. In 6 cases, these structures contained what we believe to be navigational data. She waited. Navigational data that does not correspond to any routes in our records. She waited some more. We are, it said, and paused. And the pause was longer than any observer pause she had heard. Reconsidering our documentation methodology. She turned from the window. Outside, the mist was getting lighter, the clouds thinning. A thin seam of sun was trying to find its way through. When you document a species, she said, you record what you observe. Comprehensively, it said. But the thing you're trying to understand about humans, she said, is something you can only observe in what we do when we think we're not being watched. She gestured at the window, at the courtyard, at the thin winter light working its way down through the breaking clouds. I'm not angry at you, you're very thorough. But thoroughness is a method, and method is only as good as what you're pointing it at. What should we be pointing it at? She thought about her mother's city with the prison walls and the layered names. She thought about the dead pixel that had blinked. She thought about Brennan with his camera down, crouching in the dark beside her, watching her hands work in the conduit gap. The noise, she said. Not the signal, the noise between things. The part you filtered out because it didn't look like data. The observer's membranes shifted. It did not respond immediately, which was, she had learned, the closest thing to respect that its kind offered. The navigational data in the archived networks, it said finally. We cannot determine where it leads. I know, she said. You do not know either. I know it leads somewhere, she said. I know it leads somewhere the people who made it needed to go. I know they didn't forget it. They compressed it. They hid it in the static. They kept it in a form that looked like nothing until someone listened to it right. She paused. That's not nothing. That's a very specific kind of stubborn. She turned back to the window. The sun had made it through. The courtyard was wet and pale, and the small trees were dripping, and from this distance through the glass, you could not quite hear the rain, but you could see the evidence of it everywhere. In the brightness of the leaves, in the way the light caught the puddles, in the small, precise weight of water drops on branches, ready to fall. In the months that followed, Anya Vasek was given a different kind of assignment. Not a subject, not a journalist's subject. Something that didn't have a name in the observer classification system, which was itself a small victory. There was a category she didn't fit into. Brennan stayed. Of course he stayed. He had his camera. He had 8 months of footage that was, in his words, the most important thing he had ever filmed, and also the thing he was least sure anyone would want to watch. Because the truth is that human stubbornness is not cinematic. It doesn't look like anything special from the outside. It looks like a woman sitting in a chair with her hands on her knees. It looks like a man aiming a camera at a ventilation panel. It looks like fingers working in the dark of a conduit gap, finding a junction by feel, applying pressure at the right angle. Anya worked with the observer linguists and the archived species data. She worked the way she always worked, methodically, in the noise, looking for the signal in what other people had filtered out. The navigational data in 31 archived networks was real. In 12 of them, it was actionable, which meant there were 31 species that had compressed something important into the parts of themselves the observers had decided were not worth watching. 31 species that had been quiet and were not gone. She could not reach them. She did not speak their languages, did not know their biology, had no idea what form their stubbornness took, or whether it looked anything like hers. But she knew what their message looked like, because she had made one herself. She knew what it felt like to compress something vital into the intervals between the things you were supposed to be doing. She knew the specific discipline of being watched and continuing anyway, quietly, in the 12-second window, in the dark below the floorboard, in the dead pixels, irregular blink. The observers were not unkind. She wanted to be fair about that. They were not cruel in any way that required intention. They simply had models, and the models were very good, and the models were not good enough. And this was the kind of problem that takes a long time to understand that you have. She was not angry. She was something more useful than angry. One morning, very early, before Brennan arrived, She stood at the window that had been a white panel and watched the courtyard in the pre-dawn gray. The small trees were bare now. It was late in the year. Their branches made patterns against the sky, irregular and specific. The kind of pattern that a certain kind of mind sees as signal and another kind of mind sees as noise. She had a memory, not from a dream but from before all this, from the signal's work, and from a night shift on a ship in the Baltic, when the static on a frequency had suddenly resolved into a transmission. And the transmission had been someone speaking a language she didn't recognize, and she had spent 40 minutes working through it, and discovered it was navigational data. Very old, from a maritime tradition she had never encountered, and her supervisor had told her to log it as anomalous and move on, and she had logged it and moved on, but she had kept a copy. Not because she knew what to do with it, but because she was someone who kept copies of things that might matter. She still had it. She had it in the part of herself the observers had not documented. She put her hand against the window, cold still. Weather on the other side, the actual world with its actual temperature. 31 species with navigational data pointing somewhere. 8 months of footage no one had decided to watch yet. 12 seconds every night, if you needed them. She had learned something in the apartment that she suspected she had always known but had never needed to articulate. That the thing which humans hard to model is not resilience, not adaptability, not ingenuity in any dramatic sense. It is much smaller than that. It is the specific human inability to accept that the noise is only noise, the refusal to filter it out, the instinct, compulsive, quiet, often inconvenient, to keep listening to the parts of the world that have been declared not worth listening to. This was not a survival strategy. She would be careful not to call it that. It was something older than strategy. It was, she thought, just the way certain humans were made, unable to look at static without wondering what was in it, unable to sit in a monitored room without counting the pixels, unable to be documented without also quietly documenting back. Brennan arrived at 0800 with his camera already running. "You're up early," he said. "I had a dream," she said. "Same city?" "Different one," she said. "I could hear it this time, the sounds of it. Traffic and rain, and someone playing something on a street corner. And I knew the name." He waited. "It doesn't matter what the name was," she said. "What matters is that I remembered it when I woke up." She turned from the window. Outside, the bare trees held their cold shapes against the sky, and the light was doing what light does when the night has just ended, finding every surface and making its claim on it, slow and persistent and entirely without urgency. "Come on," she said. "There's something I want to show you, in the conduit records." He followed her. He always followed her. Not because she led. She didn't think of herself as leading. But because they had established, somewhere in the months of filmed mornings and quiet nights and 12-second windows, a particular kind of trust. The kind that forms between two people who have been still and alert in the same dark room. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself. His camera was on. She was glad. Some things needed a witness, and a witness needed a way to carry what they'd seen. That was what the camera was for, not for the observers. Not for the documentation system, or the archival technology, or the comprehensive lossless record of everything they could model. For the versions of this story that hadn't been told yet, in 31 languages she didn't speak, in 31 worlds she'd never see, where someone was listening to the static and beginning to hear something in it. The light moved across the floor of the apartment the way light always moved, slow and certain. And Anya Vasek walked toward the conduit access, with her hands already remembering the shape of the junction in the dark. And the morning opened around her like a signal resolving from noise. Like a name coming back to you in the moment just after you've stopped trying to remember it. Arriving not with triumph, but with the quiet, almost embarrassed insistence of a thing that was always there.